From stormwater issues to infrastructure to traffic, those are some of the issues that City of Charleston Councilman Ross Appel is working on. I talk one-on-one with the councilman for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook. City of Charleston Councilman Ross Appel, welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Quintin, it is an honor and a privilege as always.
Oh, I appreciate it greatly. You are the council member for District 11, which covers now.
The shorthand way of describing my district is I represent the oldest neighborhoods in West Ashley and James Island. So everywhere around South Windermere area, south of Savannah Highway, and then sort of upper James Island, as I like to call it. So Riverland Terrace, Country Club 1 and 2, and areas like that. I am not on Johns Island.
Right, that's exactly right. And I want to talk to you about that in just a second. But in what ways, Councilman, are you engaging the constituents of your district right now?
That's a great question, and honestly, it's the most important question. Our job as council members is to hear from our constituents and make sure that we're advancing the policies at the City of Charleston to make their lives better. I campaigned on stormwater and livability issues, and we're working every day to make progress on those issues. And I'm happy to talk about numerous stormwater parks and other types of projects we have going on in both West Ashley and James Island.
Oh, yes, sir. I want to get back to that in just a second. But what are the three biggest residential concerns right now in District 11?
So I would say that stormwater is top of the list. Representing older neighborhoods like I do. These neighborhoods were developed prior to modern stormwater infrastructure and building practices. So that's issue number one. For sure, I think that, quality city services is issue number two, making sure trash gets picked up on time, things of that nature. And then number three, and we can't ever lose sight of this, is public safety. Making sure that our police and firefighters are equipped and funded and ready to serve the public, because that's the first priority of all of us as a city, is making sure everybody's safe and sound. So stormwater, public services, and public safety.
So when you talk about that modern infrastructure right now with these older neighborhoods, what exactly are those building permits, and what were those building permits prior to all of this happening?
Yeah, so let's use South Windermere as an example. The South Windermere Shopping Center was built in a marsh. We've got neighborhoods that I represent. They're some of the most premier neighborhoods in the city that don't have stormwater infrastructure. And to the extent they do have stormwater infrastructure, it's massively undersized. Like, I'll give you an example. So back in 1984, which was the year I was born.
Me too.
Oh, wow. I didn't know we were the same age.
Yes, sir.
That's great. So 38 years ago,
right.
Davis and Floyd, a very good local engineering firm, did a comprehensive citywide stormwater drainage study. And they told the City of Charleston at that time that the old Windermere neighborhood behind the South Windermere Shopping Center over there did not adequately drain. I think the number was 10 or 15%. That was the capacity of the drainage system in place for that neighborhood at the time. And essentially nothing has been done ever since. I mean, it's still a neighborhood that floods way too much, and it's very problematic. We have the largest stormwater infrastructure project in the history of my district and my area moving forward in the process right now. It's the Windermere Basin stormwater project. It's an $8 million project. We're heading into phase 2 of this project right now. We've had community outreach, community meetings, preliminary engineering. We're going to massively enhance the drainage for that neighborhood, the shopping center, areas around that whole community. And that's just one example of how a neighborhood was sort of designed in a way that was, not taking stormwater into account for some reason. And we are now having to retrofit these neighborhoods, sometimes at great expense, and great complexity when you're having to deal with all these different state agencies and other branches of government to get these projects moving forward. I'm jealous sometimes of my council member colleague, Boyd Gregg from over on Daniel Island. Daniel Island doesn't flood.
Right.
And the reason for that is because it's a newer development, engineering and has come a long way, since the 40s, 50s, et cetera, when my neighborhoods were developed. And so we've got to do a lot of work to retrofit the older neighborhoods in the city of Charleston. And that's what we're doing both in West Ashley and in James Island.
So how many neighborhoods in your district need to be retrofitted right now?
That's a good question. Certainly, Old Windermere is one. That's probably the number one most significant area. The Crescent and Wafu Heights both have very old and insufficient drainage systems. We're working on improving the drainage in those areas as well. Riverland Terrace doesn't have the best stormwater system. I mean, I would put the number just roughly off the top of my head at anywhere between 8 to 12 neighborhoods in my district. It's really every single neighborhood needs some work. But the good news is that we are making progress on projects big and small throughout the district. I'm very happy about that.
And I want to talk to you about that in the next interview that I do, because I wish I could have more time to focus on this in depth. But let me ask you, let me ask you this. So what are the expenses for actually retrofitting that is these neighborhoods?
Well, so we just talked about the Windermere Basin project. That's an $8 million project. That's the sort of magnitude of cost you're looking at to comprehensively retrofit a basin, right? It's not really by a neighborhood, by neighborhood perspective. We try to look at these water management issues, on a hydrological basin perspective, because, of course, water doesn't care what neighborhood you're in or whose jurisdiction you're in. But the thing that keeps me optimistic about solving these problems off the peninsula is, when you talk about drainage projects on the peninsula, you're oftentimes talking 9-figure projects. Spring Fishburne, the Calhoun West project that's coming up.
Oh, yeah.
Hundreds. Absolutely. Hundreds of millions of dollars. We can move the ball in a major way down the field in West Ashley and James Island with a few $1 million here, a few $1 million there. That's still big money. I'm not trying to say it's not, but we can get a lot accomplished for a lot less than some of the bigger projects on the peninsula. But it's not always multi-million-dollar projects. For example, over in Burns Downs, we completed substantial hydro excavation projects over the last couple years, as well as over in the Parkwood Farmfield neighborhood. And all that means is that's just a fancy way of saying we're digging out mud in a marsh where the outfall meets the marsh. So water has more capacity to move out when the tides change. And we spent about $300,000 over the last year hydro excavating the stormwater outfall system in Burns Downs and off of Devonshire Road back behind the Whole Foods over there. And that's an example of just like an efficient way that we can spend a little bit of money in targeted areas to help entire neighborhoods drain a lot better. So stormwater infrastructure management projects come in all sizes, everything from hundreds of millions of dollar projects on the peninsula down to a few $100,000 over in West Ashley and James Island, and everything in between. And the important thing is that we're hitting it on all fronts to truly make drainage a better situation in the city of Charleston.
So I hate to ask it in this way, but what inactive projects on the peninsula that you could ask the city to take away some millions of dollars to go to your Windermere Basin project?
Yeah, so I try to look at it from a perspective of, we need to do these projects all over the city. And I don't like to think of it in terms of a zero-sum game. In other words, I don't think doing a project on the peninsula necessarily means that's coming at West Ashley or James Island's expense. I'll give you an example. You may have heard things are costing a little bit more these days, and city infrastructure projects are no different. When I first came into office, we were estimating the Windermere Basin project that I was talking about earlier costing around $4 or $5 million. Well, now it's about $8. So this past legislative session, I was able to work with Representative Leon Stavronakis up in the State House. He helped send $1.5 million from the state for the Windermere Basin project. So that's an example of how we can find funding through other sources that don't come at the expense of vital projects elsewhere in the city.
Now, Mr. Ross, let me ask you, when it comes to the Windermere Basin, and obviously with phase 2, how much does that cost right now? Or is it, or are the costs different for different phases, I should say?
No, it's a great question. So the project's full budget right now is about $8.2 million. We spent right around $100,000 last year on surveying, public outreach, some initial modeling, things of that nature. The big ticket expenditures are going to be coming in the next fiscal year and the fiscal year after that. So we've got about $4 million planned to be spent in 2023, and then another $4 in 2024, assuming everything goes according to plan. We still need to get some permits from the Army Corps of Engineers. That could potentially slow things down. But yeah, all of these projects are sort of taken off in chunks, and the way our capital improvement plan process works for this project and all kinds of other projects is we break those expenditures down by budget year.
And how long will it take for you all to actually get that permit, and how will that affect the Basin's project?
Well, that's a great question. So as a point of comparison, and this is an example of another project I've done over in the older parts of West Ashley, the Osaka restaurant over in the South Windermere Shopping Center. There's a marsh right behind that restaurant, and we've referred to that over the years as the Osaka outfall. And the Crescent, Wapu Heights, parts of Old Windermere, and the shopping center all drain out through that pipe that goes into that marsh. And one of the projects we've been trying to do to help the flooding for those neighborhoods is clean out that marsh and that outfall, because it is silted in over time. Mud has sort of gotten into the pipe, and it restricts the amount of water that can come in and come out. It took us about 2 years to get that project permitted. And that's just an enormous amount of time and delay, to get a very vital project moving forward. We've used this example with our state and federal agencies to help get the ball rolling on trying to make this permitting process more efficient and more effective and timely, because this is an issue that pervades not just the city of Charleston and my district, but the entire city, the entire low country, the entire coastline of South Carolina. In order for low-lying areas to drain properly, the marsh outfalls have to be functioning, and it shouldn't be just this enormous multi-year expensive bureaucratic process just to clean mud out of a pipe. It's not like we're trying to destroy acres of marsh to build a marina or something. This is a government infrastructure project designed to help people out. So the permitting process can take years. It has taken years. It's been very frustrating and very educational to me to learn about all this. The good news is that we're beginning to smooth out some of those regulatory barriers. I think there's a growing awareness at the state level that we need to kind of get a little bit more efficient with these kind of issues while preserving and protecting the environment, of course. So going back to Windermere Basin, it's we're estimating this project will be completed sometime around 2024, 2025. But the one little caveat there is assuming we can get this through the regulatory agencies. But we've got a great staff at the city of Charleston. They work very hard, and this is a top priority for us, and we're going to move it forward.
So what other regulatory barriers are you fearing right now?
Oh goodness, let's maybe take a step out of stormwater for right now, and we'll talk about traffic safety infrastructure, if that's okay. My colleague, Councilman Saccharin, brought forward an item at our last council meeting about improving some key intersections down on the peninsula. And we heard from some young families with kids concerned about pedestrian safety. We heard about, of course, the tragedy of the woman in the wheelchair that got killed on East Bay Street a couple weeks ago. The problem with traffic infrastructure in Charleston, and really in South Carolina as a whole, is that municipalities have essentially no control over what happens. And the reason for that is twofold. For the most part, the DOT owns the infrastructure. They own the right-of-ways. They own the roads. As Mayor Tecklenburg pointed out at our meeting, 80% of the streets on the peninsula are owned by the state of South Carolina, which means that we don't have free authority to do what we want to do over there. We have to go through the DOT and go through their regulatory process and things of that nature. But on top of that, the city of Charleston also doesn't have a dedicated funding stream for transportation projects. You know, the half-cent sales tax that we all pay when we, you know, buy gas or buy, you know, stuff in stores, that money, 100% of that money goes to Charleston County for Charleston County to decide how to spend. They have the money. The gas tax that we all pay, that goes to the state for them to decide what they want to do with. So the city of Charleston doesn't have control of the transportation infrastructure. We don't have our own dedicated transportation revenue stream. So oftentimes we as the city, we're just sort of a advocacy group essentially when it comes to these projects. You know, when someone comes forward, constituents want to see improvements, the first call we have to make is to county council and to our state legislative delegation. And they're great folks. They work very, very hard. But anytime you put so many different cooks in a kitchen, it's sometimes difficult to get things accomplished. And it's not the way this is set up around the country, or really around the Southeast. In other areas, local governments have much more authority and control over local issues and things of that nature. So if we want to put in some crosswalks, or if we want to bump out some sidewalks, it doesn't take bringing in people from Columbia to make that thing happen. It's a lot more efficient and effective. So when you ask about regulatory barriers and things of that nature, we run into sort of the same sort of issues on the transportation safety front that we run into on the stormwater front, which is just that in order to get anything of significance involving infrastructure done in this state, it just takes a lot of moving parts across a variety of local government levels and state government levels to get anything accomplished. And that's just not efficient. And it's not a good way of delivering results for our constituents. And it's not how they do it in Georgia. It's not how they do it in North Carolina. It's not how they do it in Florida. We've got to really look at the way governments interact with one another, especially when it comes to urban areas like the city of Charleston, where we need to be a lot better at delivering simple results for our constituents.
Well, Mr. Councilman, let me ask you this. Would it be an option to put forth some sort of referendum for a transportation tax in the city of Charleston in the next couple of years?
I wish I could say we could do that. But the legislature in Columbia back in the early 90s passed a law that said local governments are not allowed to impose taxes that are not specifically authorized by the legislature. And so what that does is it prevents the city of Charleston or any other municipality around the state from coming up with their own ideas for taxes. And currently, state law does not authorize local municipalities to enact sales taxes for transportation projects. Counties can do it. Now, that's why the county has those 2 half-cent sales tax, and they're trying to fund 526. They're funding all kinds of other projects. We don't currently have the authority to do that. I think I saw that a bill has been introduced in Columbia this session to allow municipalities to have the authority to have a sales tax. I think local government should have more autonomy. We should have more control over the dollars that are generated here to be used right here in Charleston, rather than being sent up to Columbia to be spread around the state. But we're going to need that authority from the state legislature before we can do something like that in Charleston.
You talked about 526. Let me ask you this. Do you support the county taking $75 million out of the current transportation half-cents fund to begin preliminary work to build a 526 extension, which will impact residents in your district?
You know, I think that when I first came into office, the price tag for 526 was, I believe, $700 or $750 million or so. Now it's 2.1 or $2.3 billion, depending on which estimate you want to look at. I tend to think that before significant sums of money are spent on right-of-way acquisition and things of that nature, there ought to be a pretty clear plan on how that $2.1 billion is going to be funded, because that's a whole lot of money for any local government to move forward with. And so I followed along a little bit with the county council discussions over this. I think that the council members who have expressed a desire to have more information about how this project is going to be funded make a lot of good points. But by the same token, we have got to find ways to help our citizens throughout the city when it comes to infrastructure. Aside from 526, we've got the northern and southern pitchfork on Johns Island. We've got a lot of other projects that are a lot less complicated and costly than 526 that we ought to be moving forward with while we're trying to figure out how we're going to put together billions of dollars to fund a road. I'm not on county council. I don't have all the information that they have, but I tend to think it makes sense for the region to have a plan on 526 if it's going to move forward.
Has the county been able to talk to the city in depth or somewhat about this at all?
Well, I don't know about all the discussions that are taking place between our staffs and with the mayor's office and things of that nature. Nobody's talked to me about 526 on an official basis, and it may just be the case that still, there's still a lot that's in the works. But I certainly, it's an important issue. It's something that impacts my district, obviously, and I think that we all ought to be talking to each other on all these issues to make sure we're, navigating these challenges effectively.
Now, if the 526 extension, Councilman, starts on the West Ashley side and obviously on Johns Island, which is what folks are saying is the case, you have many of your constituents, as you mentioned, in your district impacted by this. What environmental impact study should the city do on this?
Well, I don't think the city of Charleston would be called upon to do an environmental impact study. I think that the county and the DOT would have to do a environmental impact statement, an EIS, as part of the NEPA federal law to evaluate environmental impacts and things of that nature. I would assume you're looking at marsh issues and things of that nature, but I have heard talk of building this 526 in stages. I'm a little concerned about the impacts on West Ashley if you just build 526 from West Ashley to Johns Island, because without completing the loop, and again, I'm not a traffic engineer. This is just my initial reaction to this. It seems like you would just be putting a lot of folks from Johns Island onto Savannah Highway, and Savannah Highway can get pretty backed up currently, as we all know. So I think if you're going to complete 526, you ought to complete the loop so you can at least move people around more efficiently than just putting a bunch of folks from Johns Island onto West Ashley and vice versa.
Obviously, a jewel in your district, as you mentioned earlier, is the South Windermere Shopping Center and also parts of Avondale. Residents love these older, charming, and eccentric centers. Yet we're hearing about a massive change to the shopping center where Whole Foods is, to include multi-family units where the old Darsh is actually located. So when you talk about Savannah Highway, Councilman, how in the world will Savannah Highway accommodate all of those additional cars?
Yeah, so I'm familiar with the redevelopment plan for the West Ashley Whole Food Shopping Center. There's no multifamily component of that project. That's going to be all retail and businesses and things of that nature. Now there is going to be a multifamily project where the old Ryans used to be
Oh,
over on
saying,
61 and Sycamore
right.
over there. Now, that's a different story. That's not my district.
Right.
I'm not as plugged in on that, but there's no massive multifamily development coming to the 17 corridor that I'm aware of.
And let me move over to James Allen if I can. I know the
Sure.
Bishop Gadsden expansion is in your district, correct?
It is. Doug, Councilman Gregory and I, we sort of are very close to one another over there, but very familiar with that issue.
Now, there are plans, as you know, for the expansion of Bishop Gadsden with the purchase of properties that were part of a historic Ferguson Village area nearby. How many properties have been purchased thus far?
That's a good question. I don't know the specific number of properties that Bishop Gadsden has acquired, but I know that certainly they are planning to expand, and they've been in communication and dialogue with the Ferguson Village Neighborhood Association. In fact, I've participated in neighborhood meetings at Bishop Gadsden with the Ferguson Village Neighborhood Association, Councilmember Gregory, and I've really been pleased by the dialogue and communication that has gone on between those neighbors over on James Island.
Now, in the idea of obviously Bishop Gadsden expanding to the north side of Camp Road, how realistic is that right now for your particular district?
Well, anytime we talk about substantial, development on James Island, we need to focus in on infrastructure. Has been a theme of our discussion today, and is often a theme of our discussions. Fortunately, this is an area where the county has identified significant funding for sidewalks and other traffic and transportation improvement projects along that Riverland Drive Camp Road area over there. So right as this additional development is coming online, we're going to be seeing some transportation improvements in that area. And one of the great things about Bishop Gadsden, there's a lot of great things about it, is as a retirement home community, you don't have a whole lot of people getting up in the morning at 7 a.m. and hopping in their car and trying to hit the road to truck into the office like a lot of folks. So in the universe of development, developments like Bishop Gadsden are actually one of the least impactful when it comes to adversely impacting our already challenged transportation infrastructure.
Now, I know this is a county issue, but how many sidewalks do you anticipate heading into that area?
Well, I think it's more about expanding the sidewalks down Riverland onto Camp and just making it a lot more of a walkable area, much safer area. So there'll be sidewalks on both sides of the street with the plans that I've seen.
Also in James Island, Councilman, there's a new Refuel gas station come to Dogwood Park on Frawley Road soon. I remember that several properties were combined to make this happen. Properties that were zoned actually for office residential, and now is actually zoned to allow it for a gas station. Will this be a ripple effect in your district?
Is this where the old Claire's gas station used to be over
Yes,
there? Okay, right by Tatum Road.
yes, sir.
Yeah, very familiar with that development. As you know, I mean that's the site of a gas station that had been there for as long as I can remember. And Refuel is actually a local company here in South Carolina, and they wanted to redevelop that site and expand the footprint of that development to incorporate. I think it was a laundromat that was right next door. And in order to do that, the zoning needed to be tweaked. At the time this was all moving forward, there was substantial community outreach. This proposed zoning change went to the planning commission, and the thought at the time is that considering the fact that this property was already a gas station, it was already on a pretty busy road, that allowing the neighboring property zoning to be changed to facilitate a larger footprint gas station would actually be a net benefit for the neighborhood, because some of those older structures were not the most aesthetically pleasing, perhaps, and that the net effect of having a more modern development there with modern light shielding and other types of mitigation would actually be a net benefit for the area. And that's why I was able to support it, and happy to have Refuel there to better serve that area. And one other thing to point out: when property is redeveloped in the city of Charleston now under our new stormwater manual, the property has to be brought into compliance with our new stormwater code, which is the strongest stormwater manual easily in the state. And so what oftentimes happens is when you have a substantial redevelopment project, it ends up benefiting surrounding areas because the property is being required to come up to code. So for example, shooting back over to South Windermere, if the current owner decides to sell to somebody else and they want to completely redevelop that shopping center, I would probably support that, because what it would entail is millions of dollars in infrastructure going in to make sure that shopping center doesn't flood neighboring properties. So that's another reason why sometimes when we have these infill development opportunities, it can sometimes be a net benefit to the community.
And what would be the net benefits for this particular gas station here on Foley Road?
Yes, so one of the ways would be by redeveloping the entire site, the gas station has to incorporate buffers between the gas station and the neighborhood to the rear. They have to make their lighting, they have to design it in such a way that it only shines down on their property, and there's various mitigation that comes into that effect. So, and none of that existed when Claire's was running, right? Because that was we call it grandfathered development, like the South Windermere Shopping Center. That's a grandfathered development. None of that is per code currently. And I was very engaged in talking with property owners off of Tatum Road behind there, making sure that they were in dialogue with the developers, making sure their questions were answered. And it's my understanding that everybody was pleased with how the project went forward. And Refuel was excellent in terms of talking with neighbors, meeting with folks, addressing concerns. A lot of these issues also got looked at the DRB. So it's been a thoroughly vetted project. I think the Refuel guys would agree with me on that, and I think it's going to be a net benefit for everybody.
So going back to Savannah Highway, Councilman, should they be combining and rezoning of properties for larger, more intense businesses?
Well, I think we have to look at each of these situations on a case by case example to see whether it makes sense in a particular instance. But I'm definitely open minded to the prospects of redeveloping older, less optimal, commercial sites along 17. And in fact, the West Ashley revitalization plan recommends that. In fact, that's what we're looking to do at Sumar Street. That's an infill redevelopment project. The Citadel Mall Epic Center, that's an infill redevelopment project if it ever happens. But that's what you have to do when you're trying to retrofit and revitalize a previously developed area. Because we're not developing West Ashley from scratch. We're having to find individual opportunities to sort of take a current state of affairs and improve the situation. And I think we have to look at this on a case-by-case basis, engage the community, get all the information out there, and make the best decision for the public.
And quickly, because they only given me 4 minutes, but
Okay.
to avoid density, Councilman, should certain residential developments in the city require at least half of their acreage to be open space?
Well, I think that you know, when you talk about requiring developments to devote portions of the site to open space, the city of Charleston already has mechanisms on our books to allow for this. It used to be called cluster developments. That sort of became loaded term, but they're now referred to in our code as conservation developments. And what it does is it allows you to sort of focus development and density on upland portions of your property while leaving lower lying areas undeveloped. So you're not filling low lying areas. It's actually making it much easier for folks to comply with our stormwater regulations that I mentioned earlier. I think that that's a good development practice. You don't want to just completely sprawl over a site. That typically is a recipe for disaster. But by concentrating development in highland places, avoiding flooding while keeping open space and drainage, on a site, I think that's the way to redevelop property.
And lastly, I know the Buck property located at the end of Howell Avenue was purchased with Greenbelt funds from the county. How much of that project has been actually completed with those funds?
That's a good question. I know the property was acquired last year. I think there are some plans to use that as a stormwater sort of retention site. I don't believe any active construction has gotten underway over there yet. But a big step in the process was acquiring the property. Councilmember Honeycutt led the way on that. The city was supportive of making that happen, and that should be a benefit over in that Central Park basin over there, which is certainly a trouble spot over on James Island.
Yes, sir. And lastly, and I'm pretty sure you'll know what I'm coming from with this.
Okay.
But we are in election time here in the city of Charleston.
Sure.
So you're up for re-election. Will you run again?
It's looking that way. It's been a very rewarding experience being on city council so far. I campaigned in 2019, was fortunate to win the election in 2019, got sworn in on January of 2020, and we all know what happened after that between COVID and post George Floyd issues in the city, the riots, budget issues, COVID, all kinds of other challenges. It's been a very unique time to serve the city of Charleston, but it's been very rewarding. We have a ton of stormwater projects moving forward, parks projects moving forward in our district. And I think I need another 4 years to see some of these matters through. And maybe I'll get a chance to talk with you a few more times. So that's another perk. So as it looks right now, unless my wife puts a stop to it, we're going to be giving it another go this fall.
And who do you support for mayor?
So I support. This is going to sound like a politician answer. I support everybody. I'm not endorsing anybody at this time. I think it's important to let this democratic process play out. I think it's good to have competition. I think it's good to have a citywide dialogue about priorities and things of that nature. But I think it would not be appropriate for me as a council member right now to get involved in that